Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissonance. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of Geopolitical Analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Paul Triolo. He's an associate partner for China and technology policy lead at Albright Stonebridge Group. I have followed Paul's insights for several years now. I find him to be one of the best analysts out there, combining technology and technology policy and politics all together. So when I'm looking for a signal amidst the noise about tech, and there is so much noise about tech, Paul is one of the first people I always check, and I was really flattered that he agreed to come on the podcast and talk to us primarily about semiconductors and artificial intelligence, but as you'll hear at the end of the episode, he wants to talk about EVs next, so I didn't scare him away too much. Thanks, Paul, for coming on. Listeners, if you want to talk about our wealth management services, our research and consulting services, or if you want to email me about guests that I should have on or your thoughts about the podcast, you can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. Otherwise, that's it. Cheers and see you out there. Paul, thanks so much for making the time, and thanks for accepting a random invitation from a stranger on social media. I know that's a dangerous business these days, as social media is becoming murkier and murkier waters, but we really appreciate you coming on.
I meet the nicest people through social media, so I'm happy to have connected.
That's good. I hope it keeps up that way. I sometimes worry that X will eventually disappear and we'll all go back to carrier pigeons or something like that.
Every day I keep hearing people saying they're leaving X or they're going somewhere else, but I think that right now there's still a critical mass there, which I think is important. So anyway,
I feel that way too, and and it feels like they're the only game in town. But because I've heard people going to alternatives, but I don't know of any alternatives that are actually working that way.
I'm with you.
Well, anyway, I've been a fan of your work for a long time, and we have no shortage of things to talk about. Like I doubt we're even going to scratch the surface with our 45 or 50 minutes that we have here. But I guess I just wanted to start off with a pretty high-level question, which is, I feel like the buzzwords, especially among geopolitical analysts, and I'm guilty of this sometimes too, are deglobalization, multipolarity, nearshoring, breakdown of U.S. China relationship. And somebody who focuses on tech like you do, you usually raise your hand and you say, great, none of that's possible. Like, tech companies are still completely dependent on China. How are you supposed to repair all these supply chains sort of quickly? And I guess I just wanted to start off at a high level. Do those words have any currency for you? Is there any sense in which that is happening? Do you think it's just a total impossibility and it's all an ideological thing that governments are using? How do you think about, multipolarity and deglobalization in the context of these tech supply chains, which in some ways are the platonic ideal of free trade and globalization?
No, that's a great question. And, we do have the luxury sometimes of thinking those big thoughts, right? As we're dealing with the sort of tactical salvos that are coming at us in my world, with clients dealing with, the export controls last week, right? That those sorts of things are still reverberating throughout my tech policy space. But I think, there's, if you step back a little bit, I think, there is obviously, coming out of the pandemic and coming out of this concern about supply chain dependencies, there's sort of a process that was also beginning before the pandemic of just concern about within governments about concentration of manufacturing capacity, whether it was PPE or semiconductors or whatever. The pandemic sort of surfaced some of these issues. So there's sort of, even outside the U.S. China relationship, which is driving a lot of the decoupling rhetoric, you had a situation where governments were more and more at least attuned to the idea that supply chains mattered and where stuff gets manufactured matters, and that they needed to understand that better. So that also has translated into then more industrial policy, right? So there's sort of that backdrop happening. And then the U.S. China relationship has introduced another element to this, and this is sort of decoupling, de-risking, and that's coming from a little different direction. It was just coming from sort of this sense, this long-term sense that, for example, China isn't living up to its WTO commitments, and the trade system hasn't really worked to sort of change behavior in China, and so and a much more hostile U.S.-China relationship, and that has led to this idea that the U.S. and China there should be some level of decoupling, and particularly in the high technology sectors, because the high tech sectors have become now the stuff of national security interest. And so, Jake Sullivan, I usually point to the Sullivan Doctrine last year as a pretty big turning point. People may not have focused on it, but he for the first time in forever, outlined what technology policy was in the U.S. vis-a-vis China, and that sort of implies a certain amount of decoupling or a certain amount of reduction of dependence, and that's in the advanced compute, biotech, and green tech, and those are all very complicated and different supply chains. But certainly there's a sort of meme out there that the U.S. and China are in confrontation, and that involves some level of decoupling or de-risking around those issues. And then those all also involve supply chains. So that sort of dovetails with that broader trend of concern among governments, U.S. governments and like-minded governments, about how they understand supply chains and choke points and potential resilience and decoupling. Now, there's a lot of fuzziness around some of those terms too, right? And how you define them. But the U.S. and the EU, for example, have settled on this idea of de-risking rather than decoupling, right? So the administration, for example, is very adamant about saying this isn't about decoupling, and that's because U.S. and China have such a entangled economies, right? It's really tough. So in some industries, it is just impossible to talk about either decoupling. You can talk about some minimal level of de-risking. Then the question becomes how much de-risking is enough, and that's sort of one of the rubs about the things I write about often is everybody can agree that okay, maybe it's good to have some less dependence, but companies are doing this all the time. They're not like they de-risk their supply chains all the time. But then from a government point of view, what's the sort of, how far do you go? How much intervention in industry, how much intervention in supply chains, how much intervention in markets is good, right? And how much might be bad or overshooting. So that's sort of where the debate is right now.
Well, in your experience, what is happening in real life? I mean, some of the clients that I work with, like you hear on the one hand, the goal is to move away, and it's a goal. It's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, or some are doubling down and saying China's the next China. I mean, in practice, do you feel like that's actually what is happening, or is the U.S. government saying one thing and industry is saying something else, and they're actually clashing a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, well, the U.S. government is doing something, right? So the U.S. government both governments in China and in the U.S. are taking actions that contribute to this, right? But from an industry point of view, it really depends on the industries. So we work with, IT clients and agricultural clients and cosmetics and, a whole apparel and a whole bunch of different things. So the IT space is really tricky, right? Because, for example, you have companies that have, basically committed to doing advanced manufacturing in China for the last, decade. Apple is a good example, right? So they've sort of concentrated their supply chains in China. And so their clients, though, and governments to some degree are saying, hey, there's too much concentration in China. So we do, for example, a lot of crisis management scenarios where there's a crisis in the region around Taiwan, typically, right? And that disrupts supply chains. And so the goal of those is twofold. One is to figure out, have the company figure out how to deal with the real crisis. But the other one is how do they diversify their supply chains before a crisis happens so they're not as affected. And that can be really tricky because, yes, you can move, for example, some advanced manufacturing to Mexico and Thailand, but there are limitations to how much you can move, right? If you're manufacturing, let's just say, advanced desktop computers or servers in China, where all your supply chains are sort of optimized there, and you want to manufacture suddenly in Mexico, how much of that supply chain gets moved to Mexico, right? So there's limitations, and then those, how many workers and STEM workers and graduates and trained people can you hire in those other markets? So in all these industries we deal with, there's definitely around the margins, there's this sort of effort to reduce some of the dependence, and that was happening even before, arguably, before the U.S. China tech competition got underway in earnest in 2017, before the pandemic, in part because China, that China was no longer a cheap place to. It wasn't about labor anymore. It was the labor was getting expensive, and so companies were already looking at places like Southeast Asia and Mexico as alternatives. But now the geopolitics, sort of militates towards, driving more of that. But Apple, getting back to Apple is a classic example, right? They're in Zhengzhou. They make 90% of iPhones in Zhengzhou, and they have this very sweet deal with the Chinese government. And they have a very well-trained workforce. They have Foxconn, interestingly, a Taiwan company that's doing the contract manufacturing. But everybody's saying, oh, they're going to move their supply chains to India. But it's tricky, right? Because India doesn't have the same infrastructure, export-oriented infrastructure, doesn't have the skilled workforce. The cultural issues are very challenging. And again, guess what? Even if they're going to move some production to India, all their Chinese suppliers are going to go with them. So Chinese companies are also following some of these manufacturers that are also diversifying offshore. So it's never a very simple matter of, reducing your dependence on China mainland. It's really, you end up still having some dependence. And then the question of sort of where the government plays in all that is what's sort of making companies a little bit, apoplectic, because if you impose export controls, for example, and you force some of this to happen, right? Like maybe I'm going to do my R&D somewhere else, outside the U.S. or outside places where the U.S. can control can impose controls on my supply chain. So overlaying the sort of economics of each company's sort of calculus and supply chains, there is this really complicated element of both control and industrial policy, which we can talk about, which weren't there really arguably even before the pandemic, at least in the case of U.S. companies. So now you have a sort of a very much more complicated equation to figure out. We help companies do that, right? Like because you have many companies that are European companies manufacturing in China for the U.S. market and for the China market, and for the Southeast Asian market. And now they have to figure out, do they divide up those supply chains and just have, their China operations supply China and then have their European operations supply North America? Nobody wants to do that, right? Nobody wants to really fully do that. So they have to figure out what makes sense for them to do around the margins to reduce the risk, but not like have to recreate, and at great expense, these supply chains. So that's where companies are caught in. It's almost like a three-way political risk, right? And that's, it's good for our business, right?
Yeah.
But it's tricky for companies because they were already, as I said, thinking about these things, but now it's a much more complicated equation they have to solve for it.
Yeah, Japanese companies are the only ones I know that seem to have the stomach for the sort of dual supply chains that you're talking about. Like, okay, the China-specific supply chain and then the everything else supply chain. So often I feel like, you start exploring other options, whether it's a Vietnam or an India, Mexico, Indonesia, depending what industry you're in, and you do the work and then you present the results. And usually the look I get is like, well, why can't I stay in, like, shouldn't I just stay in China? Like, this doesn't sound like it actually does anything for me.
Right. And again, that infrastructure piece is so critical, people miss, which is China has built a really robust national infrastructure, high-speed rail and really good transport and shipping and which is all, optimized for advanced manufacturing in China, get things in and out quickly. India, for example, is just, it's sort of a basket case, right? You have these pockets of excellence in infrastructure, but the whole country is not integrated. And the Chinese have also bent over backwards to make it easy for companies to do business in China, in that sector, right? I mean, there are other sectors where it's not easy to do business in China, but in terms of manufacturing, it's just they've sort of been optimizing this for maybe 2 decades. And so for companies to choose to diversify away from China, it's a really difficult thing, is their customers are asking for it, right? So we have our clients coming to us and say, well, our customers are asking for us to diversify away from China, and so so they have to sort of at least try to do it. But when it comes down to it, it's tough. The example I gave before, like Mexico, okay, you're going to do some manufacturing there, but how much are you going to move your supply chain there, and how many parts of it? And some things are easy, right? You can do, and then other things you can ship by air, and maybe the cost isn't that much. But it's a new game for these companies to play. And then, the sort of the overlay on that, which is major disruptions to supply chains by things like export controls. I mean, think of the controls that came out last week, and, NVIDIA is manufacturing complicated GPUs in Taiwan, and they're shipping them to China to be incorporated in servers for the China market, right? And now that's all disrupted. They've invested a tremendous amount of time and money in that. They've co-developed some of those GPUs in China, with Inspur, and now they have to figure out, how do I not abandon the China market, which is huge and growing, and sort of work around these really tough export controls, which I hadn't really factored into my business plans, 2 years ago. So
All right.
those things are tough.
Yeah, I want to come back to NVIDIA in one second, but before we leave this last thing, I mean, you mentioned the example of Mexico, and another thing that has sort of been bothering me there is because one argument for moving to a place like Mexico is that you're now protecting intellectual property, and now that the Chinese Communist Party is not going to get its hands on the intellectual property because you're in some other market. But then the problem is, well, isn't Huawei in Mexico already, and isn't China in Mexico already? And in some ways, is there any place where your intellectual property is secure in the world? Like if you're making those sorts of decisions, I don't know that there is a place except the United States, and even the United States has, leaks there as well. So, I mean, is there any place for companies to feel comfortable about intellectual property, or is it just kind of the Wild West out there?
Well, that's a great question. I think it depends. I mean, and companies, that issue of sort of theft of intellectual property is, it used to be more about forced tech transfer, right? And then there was always sort of some intellectual property issues. But for companies doing advanced manufacturing in a place like China, that's not really that much of an issue, right? Because they're doing the R&D and the development, like Apple, in Cupertino, right, or in Texas. They're not, and so they're not necessarily the IP is well protected in their view, right? The actual core IP, and they're doing, they have trusted partners in China like Foxconn or whatever. They sort of they have that, at least the advanced manufacturing of advanced IT products. That's not such a worry, and probably the worry in Mexico is more, you have the cartels, and maybe you're going to have, violence against your employees or something, random acts of violence. And China seems pretty, safe in that sense, right? Because you don't have that in China. But IP, I think, is less. Again, depending on the industry, I think it's less of an issue. And if it's cyber theft of IP, which I followed for many years, it doesn't really matter where you are, your company. If the Chinese want to go after your IP, it can be, and you're in Mexico, you're not necessarily protected. But for most of these industry companies like NVIDIA and others, they're very good at protecting their core IP, and a lot of that is done, in the U.S. or Taiwan, for example. Like there's a lot of R&D that's done in Taiwan where, it's arguably maybe better protected, although we can argue about that, how much access Chinese companies may have to that. But companies that I deal with are, the issue of sort of IP protection, it doesn't come up that often. It's really more about these nitty gritty issues of, what are the risks around my business being concentrated in certain areas, and then what happens if something blows up, right? I mean, we do these very well crafted scenarios with companies where we get their crisis management team together, and we do these very fun exercises for 4 hours where we shoot them real fake injects right into their email system, and like a crisis is developing over Taiwan, something short of a full military muscle movement, because then they're screwed, right? But if it's something where it's short of that, but there's still complicated issues, like how does the U.S. respond to China taking offshore islands, but no loss of life, are there sanctions, are there export controls? These are real issues that the last one we did was almost ripped from the headlines, right? Because of all the action, for example, in the South China Sea and across the Taiwan Strait. And the company found it very useful because they were like, oh, we hadn't thought of that, right? But we have people in Taiwan, we have people in China, we have shipping lanes through the Taiwan Strait. And if something happens, how do we deal with this very complicated situation, and at least have exercised that internally? So companies are now thinking more about that. I would think. I mean, almost every day I get a company coming to me and saying, "Can you do one of these exercises?" And we do them for a day, a half day. But that's a real concern now, because of the just in the last year after the Pelosi visit and all the action we had there. Companies, many companies have equities there. Like the Taiwan Strait, I think some huge percentage of the world shipping goes through there, right? And so if that's disrupted, even for a short period of time, like a blockade, it would have big impact. And so companies are now trying to think, how do I devote effort to try to mitigate the risks of that, or to get around that? But so the IP, so going to Mexico is like, okay, that is a good option in some cases, but it's still limited because, again, you have to decide how much of your supply chain you're going to sort of recreate there, and that these are costs, right? The bigger picture is, this for the global, getting back to your original question about globalization, a lot of these supply chains optimized in a more free environment, right? free flow of capital and goods and people. And, and the market was pretty good at that. And that didn't mean that people were like, didn't still have resilient supply chains. It just meant that they didn't have some of these other factors to contend with. And so, they developed these very optimized supply chains. And now that's being called into question by governments and saying, well, that, the market left to its own devices did a good job of innovation and facilitating all this, but it left with these vulnerabilities around, But if you look at each one of those, you have to understand what they mean, because there's different. It's not just like supply chains, right? There's millions of different supply chains, and you have to look at each one and say, what's the problem? So for semiconductors, for example, it's really about Taiwan, right? It's not about a concentration anywhere else in the world except for Taiwan. It just happens to the market optimized, and TSMC was so good that they ended up with 90% of the capacity for advanced semiconductors and 60% of the foundry capacity. But that was a good thing, right? It wasn't a bad thing. It wasn't like, a conspiracy to do that. It was like, the market led to that, right? And that enabled us to have these very capable systems, and now we're sort of thinking, well, that's bad, then we have to figure out how bad is it and what do we want to do to fix it. And that the problem is that, something like the U.S. is coming to industrial policy late in the game, right? When it cost, $40 billion to build a fab in Arizona, right? And so that's one of their challenges is, governments sort of intervening in places where they don't understand necessarily to the full, complexity of global supply chains. And then they're trying to do industrial policy without having done it for a long time, right? China is pretty good at industrial policy, as you know, and Japan is very good at industrial policy, but the U.S. hasn't done it for a long time. And so it has a lot of challenges, and that makes problems for my clients.
I can't help but think about that House committee. I think it was the House or either Senate or House, but I think it was a House committee meeting where one of the Congress persons said, was asking, what is a Substack? Because somebody was presenting evidence from a Substack, right, and the congressman couldn't get their idea. I don't know what a Substack is, so let alone that we're doing industrial policy at this scale.
And now they're trying to do industrial policy around AI, frontier AI, right? Like the mind boggles.
I know. Well, because
we have a lot of clients
done
in the
such
AI
a good
space
job with crypto.
Yeah, crypto. Yeah, forget about crypto. Oh my God, There are actually a few in Congress who really understand crypto. And actually AI is a good example. I was asked this yesterday on, I testified in front of the House of Lords on China's generative AI regulation. And I praised the U.S., the efforts over the last year for the U.S. Congress and the executive branch to get smart on AI, right? They've done, a year ago, I would have said, I don't know who understands AI, but now, Secretary Raimondo at Commerce is smart on AI, and a bunch of people at the White House are smart on AI, but that's a sort of a sea change. And then on semiconductors, of course, it took a long time for the Commerce Department to become sort of the epicenter and develop the CHIPS Program Office. So it had some deeper understanding of supply chains and how to craft an industrial policy that makes sense and is sustainable, for the next decade. But that's one of the challenges is governments are sort of leaping into this, and in some cases they don't really have a lot of experience. It was described, the CHIPS Act was described to me by one person as, like the plane's taking off and we're building it as we're going here, right? Because but we have to because politically there was a lot of pressure to do something to reduce that dependence on Taiwan and to reshore advanced manufacturing in the U.S. But it's a hard equation to solve for, and you need to sort of have experience in how all these supply chains work, so you don't end up, with collateral damage to the system.
Yeah. You already mentioned Jake Sullivan, and so this is actually a good time to ask about this because he published an article in Foreign Affairs, I guess yesterday or the day before. I don't know where he gets time to do all this with his schedule and how he's I'm assuming he has underlings.
I wonder who really wrote that one. But yeah, no, he's very prolific.
Probably ChatGPT played a major role, I would think. But he has a whole section in there about artificial intelligence and the challenge of China as a competitor, but not as an enemy, and et cetera. But he even sort of closes with, yes, like we're engaged in technical competition with China, but we also have to work with them to contain the risks. And that's not wobbly. That's a clear-eyed assessment of working with China over risks. And I don't know, like the U.S. and China couldn't work together over COVID. I read that and it feels like we're in a fantasy world. Do you think there's any real potential for the U.S. and China to work together on combating risks to artificial intelligence? I mean, it just didn't ring true to me.
That is a great question, and we are right in the middle of that debate because that it's sort of the last year has with the advent of ChatGPT and generative AI, of course, the U.S. sort of regulatory machine has sort of cranked up on both the executive branch and in Congress, as I mentioned earlier, and so and China too. China is one of the has a regulatory muscle that it is keen to exercise, and so China has in fact rushed out over the last year, generative AI regulations, which are pretty well thought out and involve a lot of industry input. And so now all of a sudden we're at a point where now the U.S. is engaged more on this, and the U.S. wants to engage like-minded allies on this. So next week, for example, there'll be the UK AI summit, safety summit, and China has been invited because interestingly here, the UK wants to play this role of a convener that can invite China and the U.S. and other countries to sort of figure out how to tackle this problem of frontier AI globally. And the Chinese are very willing to engage here on this. So they're willing to engage both bilaterally with the U.S. Secretary Raimondo raised the issue when she was there in August in Beijing, and they want to do it multilaterally here too. Now the problem is that people are divided on this. So there's one camp that says, well, the West and like-minded allies, the democratic allies, should decide first what they want to do in regulating AI, and then we can bring in the authoritarians like China. The problem is that China is such a big player in this that the other camp says, well, if we exclude China, it's going to be really hard to get sort of an interoperable regulatory system that covers this, because really you have the U.S. and China are like 90% of the development of generative AI models, large language models, for example. And, there are good companies in Canada and the UK and Israel, but very small compared to the overall pie. So if you don't include China, you're missing a huge chunk of the market. That's the argument of the other camp. So interestingly, in the UK summit, China has been invited to day one, which is about more industry discussions around the issue. And then day two is the heads of state, the government part of it. And they have not been invited to that. So it's still, even as we speak today, and I don't know by the time when this will air, but it's not clear that they're going to come, because they basically said, if we're not invited to the whole thing, we will not come. And that will be a big deal if they don't do that, because that will make the whole thing a little bit less, I think, significant if China is going to be left out of the whole thing. But the problem is that at the high level, there's sort of this agreement to talk, but at the sort of hardware level of the AI stack, the U.S. is putting very strict controls on Chinese companies' ability to obtain advanced GPUs. So China actually said, the delegation said, we may not come to London to this conference because of these export controls that were issued last week, because they're very worried about that, because that will have a big impact on their company's ability to obtain cutting edge hardware and develop large language models and train them in the cloud, et cetera. Right? So the question is, can the U.S. have it both ways, like talk to China about AI regulation, but at the same time, be cutting them off at the knees, if you will, or shooting them in the knees, or I don't know, whatever metaphor you want, in their company's ability to sort of maintain, competitiveness going forward. So the Chinese are sort of conflicted on this, and I think so is the U.S. government, because the U.S. government, there are those in the U.S. government who think, yes, we should be talking to the Chinese about this. I was in Beijing last month, and I had a meeting with a very senior Chinese official on another issue, and he wanted to talk about AI. Right? And I'm actually part of a track 2 dialogue. This is a sort of non-government level dialogue, academics and business people. And we're going to be talking about AI governance when I go to Beijing in December, for example. We've added it to the agenda. So everybody wants to talk about this, and the Chinese certainly want to engage, but the challenge is finding some common ground where, different systems, different regulatory systems, different impetus for the regulatory system, censorship in China, not censorship outside of China of data. These things have to be, is there some common ground that everybody can agree on? And we're at a critical juncture, I think, where we're going to find out if we can get a process started where that could be found. But it's tricky because, as I say, there are two different camps, and then China wants to play, but they want to be treated as as sort of an equal, and they want a full seat at the table. Because in general, they don't like that regulatory regimes are developed without them being at the table, particularly when they have, probably half of the world's capacity for generative AI, development. So now they really feel like they should have a seat at the table. So this next couple of weeks are going to be pretty important.
Yeah, sort of hard to argue with them about that. But that's in some ways a perfect segue for one of the other big things I wanted to ask you, which was I feel like I cannot get my hands around the trajectory of U.S. China relations on this. Because if you go back to last summer, leaks from the White House about, we're going to relax Trump era tariffs. So we're thinking of reaching out. Then Pelosi and Taiwan happens and everything goes off the rails. And then you get the first hints of the new semiconductor controls. And it contains all sorts of scary things like cloud services in addition to the chips and things like that. And then, Biden leaks to the Washington Post, I don't want to be the author of the next Cold War. Suddenly the sides start meeting together again and you're pushing forward. And these most recent, controls, the ones that were, there's the ones from last week with NVIDIA that hit NVIDIA a lot. There's the ones from earlier this month. They almost seem softer to me than some of the worst case scenarios that you might have expected. And they come roughly around the same time that, okay, South Korea, you get exemptions for some chips that you get to send to your factories in China. And Taiwan, you get some exemptions too. And here's exemptions. We're handing them out while we're also combating them at the policy level. And I just can't figure out, is the U.S. softening? Is it tightening? Is it softening and tightening at the same time? Should South Korean companies, do they have any sense of, we're always going to have a carve out, or eventually another government's going to come in and change our rules?
Right.
Like you can hear the confusion in my voice. So help me here.
Yeah, this is a lot to unpack there. So I think in general, and stepping back just quickly, the U.S. policy in that space was outlined by Jake Sullivan last year before the first really big tranche of export controls came on October 7th. Now we have October 7th and we have October 17th as two dates that will live in infamy, in terms of the U.S. China technology competition. But that Sullivan, the most important part, there were three parts to the Sullivan Doctrine. One was the U.S. wants to maintain an absolute lead over China in key technologies. And then the second one was small yard, high fence, which is an idea that's been kicking around in academia for a while, which was let's control the really sensitive stuff and put a big fence around it, right? But keep it limited. And then the third thing, though, and some of these are working against each other, are contradictory. So the third one was what I mentioned earlier, which was that advanced compute and biotech and green tech are all considered strategic force multipliers, in the words of Jake Sullivan, that are important to U.S. national security. And advanced compute means semiconductors, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and AI and quantum. So that's a pretty big yard already. If you look at, and green technology, of course, is a much bigger yard. But in the advanced compute area, U.S. companies dominate. In green tech, Chinese companies dominate. So those are two very different realms. But in advanced compute, the goal as outlined in that October 7th controls was to control China's ability domestically to do advanced compute and AI. High performance computing is the sort of term of art here. And so the controls were devilishly clever and designed to affect not only Chinese companies' ability to access advanced semiconductors like GPUs that could be used for AI, but also the ability to manufacture those domestically. So that got into the whole semiconductor manufacturing tool space. And so those controls were really unprecedented in the sense that they were attempting to basically like stifle China's ability to freeze China at some level, right? To freeze China at some notional level of development of its sort of advanced compute capacity. Now the problem is, by that time China had a pretty advanced compute capacity, right? They have like 350 out of the top 500 supercomputers already on the top 500 list. Only a few of which use GPUs. And so the argument really is really more like, okay, well, these advanced GPUs, at some point in the future, China could develop a advanced AI model that could give it some edge in a future military conflict. Now, I'm one who's very skeptical about argument. The export controls previously had been used for very narrow things like weapons of mass destruction that everybody can agree is a problem now. Right, and restricting Iran's ability to get a nuclear weapon makes sense, right? And it's easy to measure the metric, like either they have a weapon or they don't. Luckily, right now, for example, they don't have a weapon, and everybody thinks that's a good thing. But if you're trying to essentially control a future use of AI that might develop, that might give China an edge and might be used militarily, it's a really tough thing because it's hard to define the metrics. How do you know you've succeeded? And in the meantime, you are actually, for example, undercutting sales of GPUs to the China market for key U.S. technology companies like NVIDIA, Intel, and AMD. And so that dynamic is very much at work. And so there's a lot of I think the policy is based on the assumption also that you can, which is a false assumption, that the U.S. companies have unique technology that the secret sauce you can sort of lock in a box and not give it to China, and that means China can't do it. But really, these technologies are constantly evolving, and they're sort of applied science, right? And so there's many ways to do these different things, and so we've already seen Chinese companies that are prevented from getting stuff. They figure out ways to do it, right? So the Huawei Mate 60 is a great example of that, where they figured, SMIC that manufactures semiconductors, they're restricted from getting U.S. tools, but they figured out how to use their existing tools and get around that, and they've made a pretty good semiconductor. And so the problem is that the goal here is sort of a little bit murky, and also allies don't necessarily buy into that goal, right, of stopping China's AI development. And then the tools you're using are these very crude things like export controls, which have all these unintended effects and are really hard to enforce, and lots of leakage and lots of ways around it. And then the cost is pretty high to your companies because the collateral damage is high. And then finally, the metrics are really hard to determine. Like, how do you know you've succeeded? So that's sort of where we are right now, which is the U.S. government's pursuing this policy. And then this export control policy, which is designed to prevent China from getting and developing domestically advanced compute and GPUs. But this is happening as part of this. You mentioned the bilateral relationship, and of course, from Chinese point of view, the U.S. is saying small yard high fence, national security, but the Chinese view is that this is like trying to contain China's technology development, because the vast majority of GPUs, for example, right now in AI are used for non-military purposes. They're used for drug discovery or materials discovery or healthcare, detecting tumors, and so the argument that the U.S. is just controlling the small number of chips for this military purpose is really when you really unpack it, I just don't buy it, frankly. I just think it's based on sort of misperception of how these chips are used and also how technology evolves. So what we've essentially done is incentivized Chinese companies to massively, for example, to get better and innovate, because they have to now, because before they could just buy the best chip. Now they have to figure out how to make it. And so the tool makers, for example, in China over the last year have integrated vertically, and they're working closely with the fabs in China. And that's why SMIC could design that and build that, or could figure out how to build that chip for Huawei. And so over time, that's going to erode the market share, for example, of U.S. Tool makers. So we're in this weird situation where the U.S. is talking about technology competition. But the Chinese view this as very negative, and then they're gonna retaliate. And I'm afraid that, for example, after the APEC meeting next month, which is everybody is pointing to, we might be back in this sort of tit for tat thing where U.S. controls something and then China controls critical minerals, because China does have a lot of tools in the toolbox, and then that green tech space, for example, and other critical mineral space, they dominate those supply chains, so they can make it really ugly for the U.S. and U.S. companies if they decide to cut off, for example, some of those critical minerals. So, we're in this weird situation where both sides have tools, and both of them now, the Chinese now are learning from the U.S. effort to control technology and say, well, we can play that same game too. And again, my companies that I work with are oftentimes in the middle of that, right, where they have a U.S. risk and a China risk, and they want to do a joint venture that involves technology in this contested space, and they have a really hard time figuring out, where they're going to get pressure from, U.S. government, Chinese government. So it's a bit of a mess right now, frankly. And the worst case scenario is that leads to the relationship getting much worse, right? Like that's where the scenarios around Taiwan come in, right? Like this all leads to a situation where the relationship slides further, and then the chance for conflict goes up, and nobody really wants that. Right?
Well, and it also leads to the worst of both worlds, because probably you freeze not just China's tech advancement, but everybody's tech advancement, because you're taking such a big cog out of the machine, and you freeze people's green energy tech transition, because suddenly the countries that would want to use it, you're not getting sort of the cross pollination there. I'm conscious of, and obviously the U.S. and China are the two biggest seats at this table, but I feel like I don't go a week without India wants to build it wants to build its own domestic
Yep.
semiconductor capacity. And Turkey, I saw a couple months ago, we're setting up like semiconductor lab. We're going to become a great new
But
semiconductor fab capacity state. Like everywhere you look, it feels like it's the new thing. Is anybody else relevant to this conference? I mean, I know obviously ASML, therefore the Netherlands and the EU have to be somewhat party to this conversation because they control some of the tool making things. But is this really a U.S. China story, or can you see a world in which 5 different countries are making semiconductor supply chains 5-10 years from now?
that's a great question. So really, you only in the semiconductor manufacturing part of the equation, you really only have the U.S., Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and Europe. Right? And Israel, there's some Israel, but Israel has Intel facilities there, so they're not really an independent player. So there's a very small number of manufacturers. The tool side is also pretty small, right? But in there, it's really Japan, the Netherlands, Germany has a role in the supply chains, South Korea, Taiwan, and the U.S. So these are pretty small areas. So the problem is, yes, everybody wants to do manufacturing, but it's really hard to develop an ecosystem that can support that. And that's both on the sort of upstream side, like STEM education and all the different pieces of the supply chain. And then it's on the downstream side, you got to have customers, to buy that. You have to have a robust market. So India is a really good example of that. So India, yes, Modi wants to have a semiconductor fab in India that's sort of more or less, somewhere near the cutting edge. But India again has a really weak infrastructure. It's hard to do business there, and then it turns out to be really hard to build a fab in a country like that without some of these key essential pieces that you need. So India has, for example, a $10 billion government program to build a fab. And I know a lot of the people that are involved there, the India Semiconductor Mission, we work with them pretty closely. They actually wanted my company to help them review some of the proposals for fabs that they're getting as part of this subsidy program. But my impression was they didn't really understand how complicated this is to do. Right? You don't invest 3 or 4 or 5 billion or 10, let alone 10 or 15 or 20 billion dollars in a facility sort of on spec, right? So, for example, when TSMC builds a new fab, before they even build it, the capacity is already booked, by NVIDIA or Apple or somebody, right? So they know that they're going to build that $20 billion facility and they're going to be able to amortize the cost of that over time. And so in India, the problem is like a chicken and egg thing. How do you build a sort of a foundry in India or a factory that people are going to want to buy stuff from when you've never done it before? So it's a really tough thing to break in. There's the barriers to enter are high. You have to, that's why that's limited to these different countries. And even with the onshoring and friendshoring, it's TSMC building a facility in Japan, or TSMC building a facility in Europe, or Samsung and SK Hynix building facilities in the U.S., right? So it's not necessarily those countries, or the EU. The EU actually has some good semiconductor companies like NXP and Infineon. So it has already some players there. But it's really hard for a country like India which doesn't have a sort of history of manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, and let alone in semiconductors, which is really the hardest thing that humans do together as a species, probably, is to build the chip that went into the heart of this phone. It's really, really hard, right? There's just so many pieces to it, so many technologies to master, and no one country can do all of them. And so what's happened is you have, a small number of companies in different countries that end up shaking out and being able to lead and invest the amount you need in R&D to actually do it. And India is trying to sort of leap into that space. And what people advise them, and I advise them to do, is build that ecosystem first, right? Like build up R&D and build up some education system and build up the infrastructure, and then think about how you might have a fab and build up that domestic electronics industry or auto industry. EVs use a lot of semiconductors, for example, so EVs will be a big source of. But you have to have sort of that. You have to have all those pieces together for the fab or the factory itself to make commercial sense, right? And you can't sort of, as I say, you can't just build it on spec and hope that people will come, because it's going to take 5 years to do that. So you're going to be sinking a lot of money into that, and then you have to have some expectation that you're gonna be able to recoup that. And so India is spending particularly if you're spending public money, right? Like India is spending, that they woke up one morning and realized, oh God, we have $10 billion of public money here. How do we ensure that the projects are right and that, they'll be in 5 years, they're going to be successful, right? And that's hard. That's really hard to do. And the U.S. is doing the same thing, right, with the chips program. But they're inviting, established companies to come to the U.S. and build facilities, or they're subsidizing Intel, which is a fabulous technology company, and they're incentivizing them to build facilities in the U.S. So it's not as much of a gamble. Whereas in India it is. In Japan, they sort of decided something different. They decided to sort of leap to the high end and focus on 2 nanometers and packaging, advanced packaging, and not try to compete, develop an industry, for example, to compete with TSMC or other mature node companies, because it's too big of a gamble. But even there, they're going to spend billions of yen, tens of billions of yen, maybe hundreds of billions of yen, to build up this factory in northern Hokkaido, a company called Rapidus. And it's a little bit of a gamble, because they don't know at the end of the day who the clients are going to be, the customers are going to be, is the technology going to be successful? But they see it as helping to build the ecosystem, because as part of that, they're going to invest in education, and they're going to try to develop a culture of hardware manufacturing, right? Which the U.S. hasn't had for years. And so that's the challenge even for a place like India, is how do you build out that sort of culture of doing this? Morris Chang, who founded TSMC, he's skeptical, right? Because he built TSMC in Taiwan over a 40-year period into the amazing juggernaut that it is. And he's skeptical that the U.S. is serious about the long-term commitment to advanced manufacturing, and India, let alone India, right? Which has a whole bunch of other problems. And so this is a really tough business. And as I said, the economics of it are really tough, right? You can't jump into this and without a very clear sense of the technology base that you're doing and the roadmap ahead, and then also the commercial roadmap. And I think that's where India is having a lot of challenges.
Yeah. As I feared, we're running out of time, and we're only going to scratch the surface. So the next question you could probably spend an hour on, but we'll try to just limit ourselves and then maybe come back for a future conversation. But which is the picture that you paint, and the picture that I see is pretty grim from that regard, because when you start looking at, artificial intelligence is supposed to power growth by returning productivity to the labor force for the first time in 30 years. Internet of Things is supposed to revolutionize everything from agriculture to manufacturing, because now machines are going to do it, and they're going to do it better. And all of that's going to be powered by 5G networks with low latency and high speeds and everything else. Sounds like a wonderful world. I'd love to live in it. We need chips for all of it. Where are the chips going to come from if we're all stuck, flinging mud and export controls and maybe capital controls and Taiwan Strait crises and everything else in between? Are we going to have the chips for all of these industries that are promising growth for the future? Because I see theoretically how artificial intelligence could revolutionize industry, but how do we get from where we are today to, okay, we have the chips in the ecosystem to reach that next stage? Because that leap seems pretty, as I said, grim. It doesn't look like a particularly easy slog right now.
Well, again, there's a couple of different ways to unpack that. So, you have sort of the bulk of the semiconductor industry, for example, is what you would call mature or legacy nodes. So this is things like that go into your car, controllers for different pieces of equipment. That's a big part of the semiconductor industry. The sort of high end, the really advanced stuff that goes into your phone, or the GPUs that are used to train AI, that's a really sort of narrow but really critical, important part of the advanced stuff. So the challenge is, for the whole industry to make sense, companies have to have a sort of solid income base, based on the legacy chips that are lower margin, but they're sort of steady business, big part of the business. And then they can invest in R&D for the higher stuff. And then you have these very few companies now, for example, at the cutting edge, like NVIDIA, Qualcomm, AMD, Intel, that are, and Apple, of course, that want to design and have somebody else build their advanced semiconductors, which is a big trend in the industry. But the problem is you have small numbers of companies doing that most advanced design, and small numbers of companies building that. So you basically right now you have Samsung and TSMC, and then Intel is jumping into the so-called foundry business, which is companies that manufacture somebody else's designs. They focus just on the advanced manufacturing. So that was sort of the problem in the chip shortage was, the auto companies, for example, didn't manage their supply chains well, and they sort of canceled all these cars that they're building during the pandemic, and then all that capacity got shifted over to more advanced stuff because it's higher margin, and the fabs have to keep the production lines going, and so they shifted it over there. But it really isn't a shortage of capacity for example, for mature nodes. It's distributed a little bit unevenly. But China's a big player in this, right? China also produces a lot of mature node technology. So it's complicated. So the export controls are complicated because the U.S. has export controls on SMIC, but SMIC's customers, for example, are U.S. companies and SMIC is producing a mature node technology and semiconductors for U.S. companies. So the export controls are making it really hard to manage that relationship because you can't really. Some Congress people, like the House Select Committee, want to cut off SMIC from all U.S. tools, but you can't do that because then you're going to be damaging U.S. companies. So the sort of the export control piece is complicating that equation, both at sort of the mature and legacy end, and at the high end. Like, for example, all the GPUs in the world are manufactured in one location in Taiwan. I was there a couple months ago, sitting in Tainan Science Park, and within about a mile radius of me, all the advanced GPUs are manufactured and packaged in that one area, right? And what's happening now is, of course, everybody is building these large language models, so everybody wants those advanced GPUs, and there's a big shortage of those going forward. But the market will eventually solve that problem. Taiwan will build up more packaging capacity. Other players will jump into the market to build advanced GPUs. Already, Intel is going to be playing in that more, and AMD is another player. So I'm not too worried about that. But your broader question about sort of AI and how all will come together. I mean, it's sort of happening already. I mean, it's just we're sort of in the first inning of like generative AI, for example. So it depends. Broader AI applications have been around for a long time, but everybody is now just, the hype is around generative AI and how those large language models will enable this productivity and all these things. But it's already happening. I mean, I use Bard and ChatGPT every day, right, to help me with my work. The sort of enterprise level applications of that are just coming into focus now, right? Because in China, for example, all the companies in China are focused very much on enterprise applications, not on putting out a general purpose, ChatGPT client for people to play with, although they're also doing that. But they're really focused on how enterprises can take those models, train it with their own data, and then optimize, some part of their business internally. Huawei is doing that big time, using their large language model to optimize mining operations, for mining companies, for example. So that's happening. We're early on here, and there's not a lot of definitive use cases which say, well, the use of this large language model increased this company's productivity. But we're getting there. It's slowly moving into that. And then that has generated this huge demand for the hardware to train those large language models. And so NVIDIA can lose business in China, and still it's the demand for those GPUs is still sky high, and will be for the next foreseeable future, 1 to 2 years. So I think that there's enough capacity out there. It's in these weird sort of concentrated places. The GPUs are all made in Taiwan. The high bandwidth memory that goes into those is made largely by SK Hynix and Samsung in Korea. That's integrated into those packages. But there's the market is sort of adjusting as AI hype goes up. GPU production goes up, packaging capacity is going up. TSMC is adding this huge capacity to its 2.5D packaging facility in Tainan, for example. Other companies are rushing in to try to get into the packaging business. So it's this, this is an iterative process where something gets hyped, the market adjusts, moves in there. But all these things we've been talking about, like export controls and industrial policy, end up, interfering with the sort of, if you will, with the natural ebb and flow of the market. So companies have to now take into account, those other restrictions. and those other incentives too. It's not just restrictions, but it's incentives. Did they build a new facility in the U.S. because the CHIPS Act is offering, them some subsidies? It may not make sense for them to do that, but it may be good for their business, and so maybe they will do that. But we're in the middle of it. It's sort of an experiment, though, right? We don't really know if all these governments interfering in both on the restriction side and on the industrial policy side, are they going to really disrupt the semiconductor industry in a way that will be bad? Like build too much capacity, for example, overcapacity, or restrict things so that, for example, companies don't have a big enough market to address globally, right? Like Intel gets 35% of its revenue from China. Pat Gelsinger says, look, if you cut that off, then I don't need to build fabs in the U.S. because I don't have 35% of that market to sell to. So why am I building fabs in the U.S., right? So those things, they interact at that level, because governments, we're in this weird world where governments are interfering in the market in very profound ways, on supply chains or whatever, and then the companies have to figure out how to navigate that, and then in two or 3 years we'll probably know better how this experiment is working or not. Already TSMC, for example, just an example, is building a fab in Arizona, but it's turning out to be really, really hard, for like cultural reasons, and the U.S. doesn't have enough trained pipe fitters to build a clean room, at the cost that TSMC is used to and the quality. So they had to bring in 500 engineers from Taiwan, and then the unions got really mad, tried to block that. So that's an example of governments interfering in this industry, and then everybody agrees it's a good idea to have more in manufacturing in the U.S., but it turns out to be really hard to do that in practice because the realities of sort of the industry has worked in this really efficient way, and now you're asking it to work. You're reversing the economics in some sense, and the economics don't always work.
Yeah, I mean, somewhere David Ricardo was looking down on Taiwan and smiling and saying, all of my theories have finally come true. But it was the U.S. that was pushing this, and now it's the U.S. that's pulling the rug. Paul, I could talk to you all day, but we've taken enough of your time. I hope this was fun for you, and I hope you'll come back. And in the meantime, cheers on your travels, and we'll talk to you soon, okay?
Yeah, we should talk about EVs at some point, which is another one of my passions, because that was the green part of it. And that's really interesting too, because that's the next big, I think, battleground, if you will. Is EV battery supply chains, and and EVs themselves, right? Because Chinese companies now are big players globally now, or want to become big players globally in the EV space. And in that case, their companies control that supply chain, those battery supply chains, in a big way. And so that's it's a growth area for us. We'll work with a lot of companies in that space too. But it intersects because those EVs all use semiconductors. They use 10 times as many semiconductors as a normal car.
Yeah, because cars are becoming computers, basically. All right, well, I'm going to email you right after I hit stop on the recording to say, let's do part 2 on EVs, because I have tons of thoughts there and how...
Yeah, that's a fun topic. I'd be happy to do something on EVs. I think it's an area we're doing more and more work with. And it's also caught up in U.S. China relations, but it has a bigger global footprint too, right? It has in Europe is obviously very much a part of this, European automakers. And then there's the bigger sort of green transition and transfer to renewables issue, which is, I would argue that we don't want to have green technology dragged into the U.S. China conflict, because there are much bigger equities involved here, right? With climate change and, the future of the planet. So we want to try to be careful how that happens, because, right now, if it becomes so politicized, then it's bad for everybody, I think.
All right, well, we'll start there next time. Until then, thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.